Jack Pransky, welcome to Unbroken.
I'm very happy to be here.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the three principles?
Um, just so many people have heard this story that I have a hard time like recreating the bit. But I was involved in the field of prevention for many, many years, prevention of problem behaviors, alcohol and drug abuse, child abuse, domestic violence, delinquency, all things like that. And I got to the point where I sort of knew what I was doing. And yeah, I decided to write a book about it called Prevention, the Critical Need. And just before that book was about to go to press, I was invited to a prevention conference that a fellow named Roger Mills was speaking at. And I was suspicious because I had just spent 3 years of my life trying to find out what worked. And I'd never heard of this guy. But when he brought a couple of people with him from the housing project that he worked in, he was talking about how the housing project, which was a horrible place, had gotten completely turned around. And I could tell from listening to these people that their lives would never be the same. Like something deeply had happened with them that we were not used to seeing in prevention. So that's what got me hooked. And I ended up asking Roger Mills if I could write a book about what happened in Modello. And so I did that. And um, then I had to find the source, and the source was Sid Banks, and the rest is history.
As they say. Well,
As
that
they
was
say.
that was one of my questions. So, tell us a bit more about that book and about the community of Modello.
Well, the Modello was known to be one of the most difficult places in near Miami, Florida. And it was really a kind of a horrible community to have to live in because there was violence everywhere. Drug gangs were on every corner. There were shootings, tremendous domestic violence, tremendous abusing kids, crack addiction. It was just horrible. And so Roger Mills thought this would be the place, to test out whether Sid Banks's ideas are not ideas, what he had uncovered would work in a place of that magnitude, as opposed to the individual people who were like hovering around him at the time. And so he went in there armed with only his knowledge and understanding of the three principles. Might not have even been called three principles then. And he and hope and hope and being able to see through the presenting behavior to the core of health and beauty inside people. And he also never gave up, even though a lot of them wanted him out of there and did everything they could to get him out of there. And so he really began to, just a few people at first started catching on. And then they got together as a group that served as both a kind of like a parenting course and a PTA, and also doubled as a tenants council for the area. And so little by little, people started catching on more. And even though maybe 10 or 12 people really caught on to it and their lives changed completely, it had a ripple effect throughout the whole rest of the housing project, and the whole housing project changed.
Hmm.
And it took 2.5 years for that book.
Wow. And when you wrote the book about this experience, so you mentioned that you wanted to get back to the source of where this idea had come from. So did you at that point sort of track down Sydney Banks and talk to him?
I did. I heard that my cousin, George Pransky, was doing a seminar with him in Vancouver. And I was supposed to be doing a prevention training in Atlanta, I believe. They were paying for me to get to Atlanta and back, so I bargained with them to ship me over to Vancouver and back. And at that time, staying over a Saturday night made it much, much cheaper. And so I was able to, you know, bump into Sid Banks at that time. At first, he said he couldn't see me and, couldn't talk because he had people coming in from all over the world. But then somehow I ended up at a lunch with him and a bunch of other people. And that's where he literally blew my mind apart. I
Mm,
wrote that story up in Seduced by Consciousness.
mhm.
It's it's an amazing story to me, but you know, that's only because what happened to me is indescribable. So it's in my head, my own head.
Right. And you mentioned your work in prevention, so this must have affected that tremendously.
Yeah, I tried to then convince the field of prevention that going in the inside out direction was more efficacious than going outside in. And I was basically met with uh, deaf ears.
Mm,
I mean, some people caught on, and that was beautiful, and they, their lives were changed, and they were able to help others even better. But as far as the entire field goes, no,
mm,
because at that time, interestingly, this whole notion of what first was called research proven programs and then was called evidence based programs and came in. And so they started only paying attention to the programs, prevention programs that had a lot of research behind them that showed that they were good. And they put all of their money into that. There was no room for innovation anymore.
mm,
We in the three principles world, or health realization as it was called at the time, didn't have big money for research. All the little research that we did, was showing great effects, but we couldn't show it on a like a peer reviewed kind of level that we can do today.
mm. Wow. And did it end up changing the field of prevention?
No,
Oh, still to this day.
to
Hmm.
this day, I'm not totally giving up on it, but it's harder to do from a retired or semi-retired perspective.
Yeah, I imagine.
But I am apparently doing a keynote speech for the New Zealand and Australian Mental Health Association in May, and so I'm talking to a bunch of traditional psychologists, and we'll see how that goes.
Oh, nice. Well, have you been to Australia before?
I have, in fact,
Oh,
I did a keynote for their organization many, many years ago when I was first getting into the principles, but I was doing it on prevention at the time. I didn't know enough about the three principles then to speak with it with great authority.
mm, nice. Well, it'll be great. Good to go back, I'm sure.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
will. I think.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was you had mentioned in a blog post recently about the wisdom of waiting for clarity, and especially in a crisis. And this is something that one of the first things that I really learned from the three principles, and it may have been from your book actually, that where I first saw that mentioned, just that uh, there's no need to rush into making a decision, that waiting for clarity is such a valuable tool. And I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Well, first of all, if it's really an emergency, like you have to do something right away, you have to do something right away.
Right.
You do whatever you can do in that situation right away. But more often than not, we tend to react to crises and emergencies through our typical knee-jerk reaction kind of thinking. And if we do that, it's not going to come out that way. Our wisdom is embedded in us, in our spiritual essence. And we can only hear it when our mind quiets and clears. It's always speaking to us, but we can only hear it when our mind quiets or clears. And that's what we want to be guided by in life, with crises or pretty much anything. When I learned to do that instead of like plowing ahead with my typical thinking, it really changed everything. Now I really take a step back, wait for my mind to clear, which doesn't always happen right away. And I know that when I hear wisdom speak to me, it has a knowing and a certainty about it that sounds different and it feels different. And so that's what I am guided by, and that's what I hope to be guided
Me too.
by.
And I noticed when I was first learning about this understanding, because preparing the questions for you, I was sort of reflecting on this. And when I was first exploring this understanding, I noticed, if I was in a situation and I felt like I had two choices and neither of them felt quite right, I hadn't had that moment of clarity, I would get impatient after a day or two and I would just pick one and carry on that way. And inevitably it wouldn't work out as well as when I learned that, sometimes clarity takes a minute to arrive. And there was never any pressure. I wasn't in an emergency situation. I just had to learn to wait for that feeling. And it is, as you say, it's a very specific feeling when the right answer comes along, the clarity.
And also, it doesn't always sound logical.
Right.
Like the wise thing to do doesn't always sound logical. Sometimes it sounds really weird. And I've learned to trust it anyway.
Mm. Hmm.
It's hard at first.
It is. Yeah, yeah.
But
I was so used to trusting my brain.
yeah,
And so
me too.
it was a new muscle that I had to develop, and that's okay. And I still slip up sometimes.
It's actually not even a new muscle. It's like a releasing of all muscles.
Oh,
So,
true.
so the wisdom can come up to us through us, from God knows where.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah,
From the
exactly.
universal mind is really where.
Right. Yeah. And so the first book that I read of yours was Somebody Should Have Told Us. And that book introduced me to the idea of not thinking our way out of problems, which was really new to me and a little disorienting at first. So can you talk about that, about not thinking our way out of problems?
Well, in a way, it's just what we were just talking about, because we all have intellects. Some are stronger than others. And for the most part, we have tried to use our intellect to get through life. And it hasn't always worked, because the place of wisdom and insight comes from a completely different realm. It's something that really does come through us and not is manufactured by us. Like the intellect is kind of manufactured by us. But so with wisdom, it's like we're releasing all the stuff that we know, and we go into I don't know mode. And I don't know mode is a really beautiful place to be, because it kind of clears the decks and it allows for things to bump up to us, to come into us. And it's such a beautiful thing when that happens. I mean, I think I put this in Seduced by Consciousness. I was talking to a medical doctor one time, doing some coaching with him. And he applies his intellect to everything. And so I said to him, so like if somebody comes to you and you've gone through all your intellect, and something isn't quite right and you don't know what it is, do you bear down and apply your intellect more, or do you take a step back and wait for clarity? And he said, I take a step back and I wait for clarity. Now, he was not doing it with his um, primary relationship at home. So I said, well, if it works there, why wouldn't it work there? But he couldn't he couldn't handle that idea for some reason, because he had different thinking about what dealing with a relationship was like, and what dealing with at work, medical practice was like. So, that was a very interesting conversation. I'll never forget it.
Mm-hmm. And when we're learning, is there anything you could say more about when we're learning to trust this wisdom that already exists within us? Anything you can point people toward about that?
Well, yeah, what's worked for them um, in the past, even though they
Mm.
didn't know what was going on. So I used to, in my trainings, I used to ask people all the time, where are you, or what are you doing when you get your best ideas? And people would come up with things like taking a walk just before I'm going to sleep, just when I'm waking up, when I'm in the shower, doing the dishes, a lot of the common denominator in all of those things is the mind relaxes.
Mm.
And so that's what we want to happen if we want to really see our way through things. We want our mind to relax. And the tendency is to do the opposite. It's like the tendency is to bear down so that we can get it right. Because sometimes stepping back and waiting for clarity feels too passive or something, but it really isn't. We could bear down and really make something happen, but as you described at the beginning, it doesn't always work out well that way.
Yeah, and so many big decisions in my life, I find every time I've gotten 10 miles down a road and then realized I didn't want to be on that road, it was because I forced a decision and didn't wait for clarity every time.
And the other part of what is built into our spiritual essence is pure peace and pure love. And that's what exists or resides in everyone, even people like the people in Modello who were, having all of those horrible problems. Everyone. And when we can first see that, well, first of all, in ourselves, then see that in other people, and then help people see that in themselves, that's what really makes a difference. And to know that we can only think our way away from it. Like, that's the most humbling thing to me of all. We've got all this beautiful stuff inside us, which is there already. We're looking for it, but it's there already. And yet we can only get in our own way. I mean, there's nothing about the three principles that is more um, amazing to me and humbling than that.
Mm.
And when people catch on to that, their lives change.
Yeah, so true. That's so great. We touched on prevention earlier in your work, both before and after you found discovered the three principles. What is the spirituality of prevention?
Well, the spirituality of prevention was something I actually got into before I found the three principles.
Mm,
It was like, well, very few people in the prevention field were looking in that direction. But I was on a spiritual search before I bumped into the three principles, where it then screeched to a halt. And um, but before that, I was going all over the place. I was like reading all kinds of spiritual books. I was listening to spiritual talks, and I was trying to grasp what about those things could be applied to the prevention field. And so that's what spirituality prevention was about, essentially. And then there were practices, like meditation and yoga and all those kinds of things. And it was all over the place. And myself and a couple of partners of mine, we had formed a group called Prevention Unlimited. And we put on the first spirituality of prevention conference in the country. And that was right about at the time when I was starting to first get into the three principles. And so I gave a workshop there on that thing. And now I really see the principles as the only real way to get a grasp on spirituality and prevention.
mm.
I
And
mean,
when, sorry, go ahead.
I may be prejudiced, but it really has worked for me, and I've seen so many lives change as a result that most people who work in prevention don't see. And
Mm.
so I'm, yeah, I mean, you couldn't knock me off this track, no matter how you try.
And so often when it comes to things like addiction, people are talking about recovery. So with prevention, what sort of communities or groups are you dealing with? People who are vulnerable to those kinds of things?
Well, anybody really, but particularly communities that are vulnerable. I mean, what we used to do in outside in prevention is we would give people information, we would teach skills, we would build supports, we would create healthy environments in the hope that those things would um, help people's minds to change, and they would experience healthy self perceptions. What now? Well, which would in turn, help people have a sense of health and well being about themselves. I mean, that was the idea. So prevention from the inside out changes that completely around. It starts with the premise, as I was saying before, that we all have health and well-being inside us already. It's just covered up with by our own thinking. And when we can point people in that direction, then they start to see that in themselves. They start gaining healthy self-perceptions. They work to change the conditions in their environment. Um, they make things better for themselves around themselves. And that's how prevention starts from the inside and goes out. And then when a critical mass of people in a community like Modello catches on, it can change entire communities.
Hmm. And does Modello still exist?
Uh, I hear that it's been completely turned into a different kind of housing.
Mm,
But even at the time, Hurricane Andrew came by and wiped out the entire community.
mm,
So you couldn't, and I mean, I went down there a month after that,
mm,
and I mean, the place had been blown apart literally.
mm,
Half of everybody's houses were gone. And so you couldn't really tell whether it would have had lasting effect over the years, except if you trace the lives of the people, which is what I did. And and their lives continued to be healthy and change even in the face of that.
mm. Wow. What a testament, if given that everything they'd been through, that's amazing.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it really is.
Yeah.
And it is the model for how this can be so helpful to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally wish that more people involved in the three principles were taking it into communities.
Mm. Yeah.
Once Roger Mills died, um, and it just kind of that emphasis fizzled.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And I remember from your book about Modello that, it did take some time for him to get a toehold in there. And I wonder, like, it seemed like a real challenge for him.
Well, he had a really good attitude about it. It would be a challenge for most people.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little for him too. People do everything in their power to get you out of there, which you can totally understand. But his attitude was, of course they're going to be acting this way toward me, given the way that they're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Force attitude to it. But he knew that's not the way they really are.
Right.
So yeah, it's more difficult than coaching people one on one. It's more difficult than going to businesses. It's more difficult than working in groups with people to go into communities like that. But it's the biggest bang for the buck, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
Sid Banks always had this feeling that the three principles were meant to be helpful to humanity
Mm-hmm.
and that we are to be of service to people. And that, to me, needs to be and continue to be the primary emphasis.
Mm. I
But
love
that's
that.
just
Well, no, I love that. That's great. Yeah. Speaking of which, you mentioned you're sort of semi-retired now, and I noticed on your blog you thought of, we're recording this in very early January 2024. You thought of December 31st as kind of the your retirement day.
of
So
last year.
of last year. Yeah, yeah. Oh, of 2022?
Yeah, it
Oh,
didn't work out that way.
no.
Um, it's kind of a joke, really. But I mean, I I consider myself semi-retired. Just being fully retired was just not in the cards.
Mm,
So now I pretty much wait for people to find me if they do, and if they don't, I'm happy with that.
mm.
I have just enough work to keep me going.
And I mean, you mentioned the word service, and I love that. And so when something um, has a feeling like that, I imagine it's impossible to just set it down and walk away.
It is. I'm afraid to say that it is.
Mm-hmm.
I really do still have this I don't know whether you'd call it an urge or desire or something, to be helpful to humanity as much as I can. So even though right now, most of my focus is on writing a book about my hobby, music,
Mhm.
uh, I still cannot, when people contact me about doing something like yourself, I
Yeah.
can't, I can't turn away from it.
Yeah. Well, I love that. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My
So we're
pleasure, really.
getting sort of towards the end of our time together. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share?
Um, well, I want to re-emphasize something.
Okay.
The principles really, at its essence, only means two things to me: that we have this pure spiritual essence embedded in our pure consciousness, connected to the purest part of universal mind, which gives us everything we need, and we can't get away from it even if we tried. And then we have thoughts, and we can, and our thoughts get picked up by our consciousness. And consciousness, its job is to make it look real. So it sends it through our senses, and it makes it look very, very real to us, which is why we get deluded into thinking that it's reality as opposed to just an illusion of our own thinking. When we're able to see our problems as illusions of our own thinking, we are free. And those two things, to me, are all we need to know about the three principles.
Mhm.
And it's only a question of going deeper into what those two things really mean. People make it very complicated. Sid Banks was always telling us we make it much too complicated. Just beginning to grasp a tiny bit of what he was talking about. It took
Mhm.
me years to get there.
And I would say though that the title of your book, Seduced by Consciousness, is a really simple encapsulation of that idea.
Yeah, it makes people scratch their heads at first, which is good. But yeah, I mean, whatever we think and believe with more thinking, we're going to get seduced by as reality.
Mhm.
Very, very tricky, because it's almost like the ego's job to make us believe it, because it doesn't want to relinquish itself. It's like holding on to itself for dear life. And will do everything in its power so that we don't realize this.
Yeah. Yeah, so true. That's so great. So where can we find out more about you and your work, Jack?
Well, my website is not really that active, but it is www.insideoutunderstanding.com. People can look me up on Facebook / Jack Pransky. Um, I posted a couple of things that I'm doing in my semi-retirement. Um, One thing I'm excited about is when I go to Australia, I'm working with a couple of people to do a training now in Bali, which is on
Mm,
my bucket list. So um, things like that are what keep me going.
nice. Okay. And I will put links in the show notes to your website. And and we've mentioned your books a couple of times, so let's just talk about that. So your books are mentioned on your website as well.
They are. Um, Somebody Should Have Told Us is probably my most popular book. It's the one that people look to for an entry into the three principles a lot. And Seduced by Consciousness is like the advanced version of that. Modello is a just an incredible story. And I'm not saying that because I wrote it, because it was an incredible story before I wrote it down, of how how not step by step, but the story of how this horrible community was completely changed around. I have a book called Parenting from the Heart, based on the three principles. One called Hope for All, which is interviews, extensive interviews with people whose lives have turned around by the three principles, and then are going off and working with others about it. Paradigm Shift was about the history of the three principles. Co-written a couple of books for kids, little kids, and one curriculum for middle school students. So I've been involved in writing. Plus, I've co-authored a bunch of research articles, peer-reviewed research articles with Tom Kelly. So I that's what I do mostly. I mean, I'm a writer.
Mhm. Well, and I, for one, am so glad that you captured the story of Modello and also this sort of the history of the three principles in Paradigm Shift. Um, it just feels so important that those things don't get lost. And I love
Yes,
that you did that. They must have been enormous projects.
they were much bigger than I thought they were going to be.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, but I think it's so important historically to see how those things happened.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jack Pransky, for being with me here today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It was fun.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.